Good morning. It's Monday, the 24th of August, 2020. Welcome back to the best on-ground weekday kickoff. I'm your host, Pete Fairbairn. And as always, I'm going to be joined today by one of Australia's top sports journalists to look at some of the biggest stories making waves in the world of sport over the weekend and on your Monday morning. And there's been no bigger story over the course of the weekend than an investigative series which is being written by Julian Linden and Jessica Halloran for News Limited. How are you, Jules?
I'm good, thanks, Pete. Yourself?
Mate, I'm very well. It's a real privilege to have you on the program straight after such a harrowing read. The story that we talk to is, of course, the story of the recently deceased Australian figure skater Katia Alexandrovskaya. And she was, of course, a young Russian figure skater who was naturalised to represent Australia at the Winter Olympics. And you'll be able to tell us some of the details of the story, which has run in the Daily Telegraph and the Australian over the last 2 or 3 days. But essentially her death's exposed some serious weaknesses of accountability, funding and welfare in sport, the management of concussion, and this is all in the harshest and most decorative of pursuits in figure skating. And we also look at the practice of trading athletes from one country representing another on the international stage. So Jules, can you, for the listeners and watchers who haven't had an opportunity to read the series yet, can you talk us through the bare bones of what's actually occurred here?
Yeah, sure, Pete. I mean, the background of the story for, most people who probably don't follow figure skating is this. Australia unearthed a very talented young figure skater, Indigenous Australian, Harley Windsor, a few years ago. And everyone had great ambitions for him to go to the Olympics, okay? And a really terrific feel-good story for everyone. Problem was, they couldn't find a partner in Australia who was at the same standard as him. He competes in pairs. So his coaches, who were based in Sydney but came from Russia, hatched a plan that they would find someone in Russia because they have so many great skaters who don't make the Russian team. So they went over there, approached a young girl who was 15 years old, asked her to come to Australia. She agreed to come to Australia. They did go to the Olympics. They won a junior world title together. But then last month, she died. She fell from an apartment in Moscow where she was. And the story basically got ignored by Russian media, by Australian media. So we did a big investigation into what went wrong. We felt we owed a duty of care to this young lady to see what happened. And what it did do was it raised a whole bunch of really, really disturbing areas that we feel, need to be properly investigated. If it had been a footy player, it would have already been investigated. But because it's a figure skater on the other side of the world, I mean, everyone's washing their hands of the whole thing.
Talk me through the practice of finding an athlete who's from another country and having them come to represent your country on the international stage, how that's kind of, I suppose, how that's received globally at the moment and how the Australian Olympic Committee have responded to your series so far.
Yeah, the whole practice is completely unregulated because they essentially leave it up to each individual sport to determine how they go about it. In the case of Katia, she was 15 years old when Australia went and approached her. When I say Australia, I mean the two coaches, okay? The Australian Olympic Committee didn't approach her, Ice Skating Federation didn't approach her, two coaches. Nonetheless, Australian Olympic Committee and Ice Skating Federation do play a role in it because they apply for applications to have her citizenship fast-tracked. So in other sports, for example, we spoke to Sebastian Coe, who's the president of World Athletics. They've looked at the practice. They've uncovered agents who actively try to shop around the best young runners to countries in the world. So they've placed a ban on it for athletes under the age of 20. But Seb Coe told us, he was just waking up and seeing so many shopping around of things of athletes, he thought it was bordering on human trafficking. So there are protocols in place there, and in this case, no one broke any of those protocols. But it sort of raises ethical issues about should we really be going to the other side of the world asking a 15-year-old girl whose father had just died, she was still mourning his death, about coming to a country on the other side of the world. And then if they do, how are we looking after them?
One of the kind of key elements of the story, we talk about her battle with alcohol. We also talk about funding cuts coming through, and we know for Olympic athletes especially that they're so dependent on funding. They're not able to rely upon big commercial deals. They're not able to rely upon the kind of professional contracts that, say, football players or cricket players can, and the certainty that comes with that. We know Cartier's funding was cut, and she was kind of sleeping on couches in Sydney, which is not what you'd expect from an international standard athlete. But the final bit I want to touch on today very briefly, and this story is in today's Daily Telegraph as well. You've spoken to a US neuroscientist who says that there's a clear link between concussion, epilepsy, and suicide. Of course, Cartier was diagnosed with epilepsy, and while it hasn't been able to be proven by the coroner, there's suspicion that suicide may be the cause of her death. What do you think from a concussion perspective and that link? Is that a key element of this story?
Oh, absolutely, it's a key element of the story, and I think one of the keys to all of this is we need to have a closer look at figure skating. Figure skating is one of the very few sports at the Winter Olympics where athletes don't wear helmets. Now, we all watch it, right? And we're sort of accustomed to seeing these young, fit, men and women doing all these great things. But we don't really actually stop and pause for a moment and go, hang on a minute, these kids haven't got helmets on. Why haven't they got helmets on? So ice is, I haven't skated too much, Pete, but I fall over a lot when I do, and it's a pretty hard surface to land on. And when they try the sort of the moves that they perform and they practice and all sorts of things like that, it's entirely plausible that they are going to suffer repeated concussions and all that sort of thing. So we have in Australia very, very good protocols around that whole sort of thing about concussions in sports like figure skating. But in reality, it's not policed very well, because you're essentially relying on athletes and coaches to self-report head knocks. Now, when athletes and coaches are preparing for events like Olympics and they're doing it at private training sessions and whatever, invariably what they do is they just brush these things off and go again. It's not like a footy match on Friday night when a bloke gets whacked in the melon, right? The trainer's straight on, they have a look and they say, right, off you go. A lot of stuff in sports like figure skating doesn't even happen at all.
And, watchers and listeners to the show will know I've been fascinated in concussion and the kind of impact that heavy hits has on your body. There's been a wonderful expose recently in the New York Times around bobsledding and, a spate of CTE cases coming out of that sport as well. It's a fascinating read. I dare say there's more to play out. Make sure you grab the Daily Telegraph and the Oz and have a read. And congratulations, Julian, on a fantastic series that you've been able to uncover, and also to Jessica Haller. And we're going to move through to our second story today. And I've just got to say again, what a privilege it is to be able to talk to the journalists about what is probably the biggest story in Australian sport at the moment. So a bit of a coup there. But our second story today, and we return to Australia and to the AFL, and the Sydney Swans, Julian, they've confirmed that Lance Franklin won't be back again in 2020. He's got some groin soreness, and we know he's had some knee and hamstring complaints already this year. Story from Lauren Wood and Tim Mitchell in the Herald Sun has some quotes from Sydney Swans football boss Charlie Gardner, who said that until this week, the Swans remained hopeful Franklin would appear before the end of the season. However, given the soreness he's experienced, we believe the best course of action is for him to focus on building his core strength, preparing for next year. He'll remain with the team and continue to assist in a mentor and coaching capacity. We know Franklin hasn't played this year. He played just the 10 games last year. He's 33 years of age. He's got 2 years remaining on a 9-year deal, which was obviously so unprecedented when he first came over from Hawthorn. What do you think we'll see from Lance Franklin over the final 2 years of his contract?
Yeah, look, I mean, I guess we're all speculating on this. Given what's happened over previous years, you would have to think that his on-field appearances and contributions are going to be curtailed a little bit. Some of that might be from injury. Some of that might be from design as well. I mean, they may look at, what is he, 33 now? So they, for a 33-year-old player, I mean, what they bring to the table is completely different from someone who's 21 years old. So I think his biggest contributions and value to the side, maybe, in something like a cameo role. You mentioned the mentoring that he could do, inspirationally to have around the team. I think that would be a huge area he can help in. Promotionally, he's been fantastic. I mean, he's the most recognisable AFL player in Sydney by a country mile. So I think there are lots of different ways. They just have to manage the way they take him forward. But his value is still there, but maybe his on-field appearances will be reduced.
Yeah, I think all football fans would be keen to see Lance play as much football as possible over that next 2 years, and it may be a case of being managed heavily and not playing a lot back-to-back. But when he's on, we know he's still one of the most watchable players in the competition. Our third story comes from Michael Chammas in the Sydney Morning Herald today, and he's talking about Josh Addo-Carr, the Fox from Melbourne Storm. He's kind of got an agreement in place with his club that he'd be able to look to move to Sydney at the end of the year, despite being contracted for one more season, provided the Storm could get a comparable player in return. Addo-Carr currently being paid around $400,000 by the Melbourne Storm, according to Chammas's article. But his manager is allegedly chasing $800,000 and pitching him as a fullback. And the ARL Commission is expected to be presented with a proposal from the NRL salary cap auditor that will address the idea of a player under contract being shopped around to go to another club on a bigger contract, and thus leaving his existing club, kind of incapable of keeping a player against their will. Jules, in general, is it reasonable to look to put in place a sanction such as this? Where do you stand on it?
Pete, I really like this story, but I don't have any great answers. It's a really murky one, isn't it? So you can't stop players wanting to get as much money as they can. Okay, and you shouldn't stop agents from trying to help them. I mean, we all know that the playing window is very, very short. But clubs equally, they need to be protected as well. So I think the conversation is great about what's the best balance here, okay? Because, you've got some conflicting interests here. I would probably lean on the side of the players, okay? I think that they should be entitled to maximise their value when they get it, because it can end very, very quickly. But it's a really good conversation. And a lot of work needs to be done in there. What do you think about it? You've background in players' unions.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think I think to mandate that a player under contract couldn't seek to negotiate a contract of a larger size at another club, I'm not supportive of that. But at the same time, players need to take responsibility. If they sign a contract, for a certain length and a certain salary, they've done the best they can to negotiate the best deal for them, not just financially, but in terms of where they want to play their football at that point in time. If a club wants to hold a player to the contract that they've signed, they should, the player should find a way to make that happen in most circumstances. The flip side of that as well, clubs need to stop trying to offload players who are under contract to other clubs and put pressure on players to leave and to take lesser deals and things like that as well. Just as a club is entitled to hold a player to account for a contract, I think a player should be entitled to say to a club, as we've seen with, say, Josh Reynolds at the West Tigers, and say, well, this is a contract you signed me on. I'm going to stay here. I'm going to fight for my place. I'm going to be a model professional, whether you're going to play me or not. I think that particular instance has been handled quite maturely, although Reynolds hasn't played a great deal of football over his 3 years at the Tigers. He hasn't, the club understands the commitment that they've made and they've been bound by that. But as you say, it's an interesting conversation. We don't want to see situations like we saw with Ryan Mattison at the end of last year, essentially forcing his way out of the Tigers to get a bigger deal at Parramatta. I just say that the club doesn't have to let the player go, but the player should also be able to hold the club to account when the situation reverses. Yeah.
It's an interesting one though, isn't it? Because there's a lot of conflicting ideas in there as well. It's a tricky one, but yeah, good yarn.
Yeah, it is good yarn. And our final story today, we turn to rugby union, and Dave Rennie, the incoming Wallabies coach, has been speaking to the Australians' Wayne Smith, talking about the importance for the Western Force to to really strengthen their squad and look to bring some overseas Australian-based players home for 2021 onwards. We know that the Western Force, of course, are backed by mining magnate Andrew Twiggy Forrest. From a financial perspective, they're the club that Rugby Australia would have the least concerns about, and that probably plays a key role. Rugby Australia being so bullish and trying to ensure that they keep 5 teams in any competition next year, and whether that's a trans-Tasman comp or a domestic one, we should find out in the next few weeks. But I think that financial stability and the guarantee of Forrest, bankrolling that team is absolutely at the heart of Rugby Australia being so happy to go so hard on 5 teams. That being said, the Western Force haven't won a game in this Super Rugby competition. They've been brave, they've come close, but the reality is that they have a squad of players that's either at the veteran level or kind of at the rookie level, and not a lot of that mid-tier experience in between. They also haven't had the opportunity to play any competitive rugby, in the first 3 or 4 months of the year before COVID hit. And I think that's telling now. They were dismantled by the Queensland Reds over the weekend on Friday night on the Gold Coast. In general, how important, Jules, is a strong Western Force in the future of Australian Super Rugby, and what do they need to do to be strong?
Yeah, I was a little heartbroken to see them get flogged on the weekend. I don't think anyone's been disappointed in the Force, but I think everyone is disappointed for the Force. I think everyone wanted to see them do well. I think everyone wanted to see them win a couple of games, but not against the state side where you come from. But it's really important. I mean, if we are going ahead with a minimum 10 or even 12 team competition with the Kiwis in the future, probably not next year, but the year after, we need the Force in there. I'm a subscriber to the idea that the more opportunities we have for good players, the more likely we are to get a better Wallabies team, as opposed to the idea that if we dilute it and we only have a couple of teams, that's going to be the best way forward. I reckon 5 teams, as many players, that's 100 blokes getting a chance to play at a higher level. So I'm all in favour of it. But But clearly they need to improve a little bit. But, they were thrown into this thing in the middle of COVID-19 at pretty short notice. They've been getting players on the fly, and they've been pretty good for 60 minutes in almost every game they've played so far. So they get a huge pass mark, but yeah, let's, I'm sure they'll be better next season when they get a few more players together.
Extremely well said. I couldn't agree with your sentiments more. And, we've got so many Australian-based players playing their rugby overseas. More Australians play rugby professionally overseas than they do here in Australia. So hopefully we can not necessarily take advantage of the uncertainty from COVID, but maybe there's some top talent overseas who have seen what's been going on and are pretty keen to come home and be part of that Western Force journey and adventure. Jules, that's all we've got time for on the Best On Ground Weekday Kickoff this morning. It's been fantastic to have you on the program and to get some real insight into, some fantastic journalism that you're doing at the moment. Thanks so much for coming on, mate.
Mate, it's been an absolute pleasure. So thanks, Pete, and thank you for helping promote journos and their stories. It's really important.
Well, that's the core element of the program, right? We get the best journos in Australia to come on, and we hear what's making waves behind the scenes, and that extra bit of insight and analysis. So it's an absolute pleasure, and looking forward to having Christy Doran from rugby.com.au on the show tomorrow. You've been watching and listening to the Best On Ground Weekday Kickoff. We'll see you later.